and start our time slot today. We've got education evaluating progress in the pandemic, going over the learning loss in the pandemic, of course by Tomi, who helped gather this research as well. So please give her a warm welcome and I'll let her take over.
Thank you. Good morning. So I'm going to be chatting today. Many of you have probably heard of the study, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It is a study through the Department of Education, congressionally mandated to track a student's educational experiences, primarily at the grades 4, 8, and 12. When I'm not moonlighting as a political science instructor here at Fort Hays, I work full-time on this study for a company out of Washington, D.C. And so I'm going to go through in the fall, there was the original or a release of data from what happened before, or let's start this over. Release of data, the first time we're seeing what students can do at grades 4 and 8 since the pandemic hit. And so today it's going to be a lot of statistics. I'm going to go over, you'll see a lot of different data points. I'll go through then a tool you can use if there is something that particularly piques your interest. Maybe it's a state related or a student variable that you are interested in tracking to see what has happened. What we can't say is that the pandemic is the only thing that impacts a student's educational experience. What we can say is we recognize that this is an event that disrupted learning, and where do we stand now? So what I like to start, and when I start a lot of my political science classes on, is a saying that mountaineers have, and that is, the truth will set you free, but first it will devastate you or break your heart. The wording they probably use is a little bit more colorful. I'm not going to say those words today, but what we can say is that there's the truth of where our students sit today can be viewed as a call for action. Student education, where students stand, how they navigate our education system affects students regardless of age, gender, socioeconomic status. So what we're going to do is seek the truth to where they stand, to develop policies and practice to meet our young learners at where they are today. In doing so, today's presentation focuses primarily on the data collected through the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And you will hear me refer to this two different ways: NAEP, its acronym, or how it's often branded to the public, the nation's report card. You'll hear a lot of data, statistical analysis, but more importantly, we will look at what is being done and where we go from here. So let's look at what the nation's report card, NAEP, is commonly referred to as the nation's report card. It is a large-scale assessment. It is a congressionally mandated large-scale assessment by the Department of Education. We do math and reading every 2 years, and there are other subjects that the National Assessment of Governing or National Assessment of Governing Board puts in: economics, technology, STEM-related subjects, history. We occasionally will assess those as well. Since 1969, the NAEP has provided a common measure for student achievement across the country. The results indicate major trends in education, including rising and falling scores in large groups and in the subgroups, such as gender, race, ethnicity. And so as a result of this assessment, we can compare across states and across time on students' educational progress. Schools, school boards, states use this data to make key policy decisions, including how they're going to spend money, where they're going to direct staffing, and also the curriculum that they're going to be teaching students. So what is the nation's report card not? And it's a very important distinction to make. It is not a state assessment. Not every student takes NAEP. It is not aligned with a specific state's curriculum. It is instead a common yardstick to gather information about students' progress, what they do know, and there also is other information gathered about students' educational experiences. And I'll go through that at the end, specifically related to their learning through COVID-19. Any questions about that?
Yeah, one quick question. Is the data collected from the schools or do the students input?
No, so what happens is when we do a sample of schools, and from that sample of school, pull a sample of students, and then those samples of students take it in about a 2-hour time block on digital assessment on devices. But we work through the Department of Education, each state has a coordinator for NAEP, and then that coordinator also works with the, I mean, it's a lot of, from the Department of Education through the state level offices, through each school or district to coordinate that. But we bring for the execution of the assessment, there is staff that comes in. It is not administered by the schools, it is administered by field staff to do the assessment. Okay, so the variables that are used when we are collecting for students is race and ethnicity, gender, whether or not a student has a disability, whether or not the student is an English language learner, whether or not the student participates in the National School Lunch Program, and the student zip code. And you can kind of develop a narrative about what those variables can help us understand about each student based on these demographics. When we report NAEP data, and I'm doing this as a primer so that when we go into we can go through some of the scores from the fall, we can understand what we can say about this data and what we can't say about this data. So when we report NAEP data, it is at the national and state level. Individual school and student level data is not reported. We can look at it based on scale scores for states, but you will not be able to pull a scale score for a specific school or district. The scale scores are developed for each subject and each grade. So what that means is that the scale scores cannot be compared across subjects. For example, I can't say a 250 scale score in reading is it better than a 250 scale score in math. The scales are developed differently. There are various achievement levels that we use to say what a student should know based on each grade assessed. It does not mean it is not indicative of grade level proficiency. But let me just quickly give you a definition of what NAEP Basic is. NAEP Basic means that there's partial mastery of prerequisite knowledge and skills that are fundamental for proficient work at this grade level. NAEP Proficient means there is solid academic performance at each grade assessed, competency over challenging subject matter. NAEP Advanced, so if we have a variable and they are NAEP Advanced, that means that there is significant superior performance in academics. So as I said earlier, grade level this does not represent grade level proficiency as determined by other assessment standards. NAEP is not designed to identify causes of change in student performance. Although we can make comparisons in student performance based on demographic characteristics and educational experience, we all know that there are many factors that influence a student's achievement, including educational policies and practices, available resource, and demographic characteristics of the student body. Such factors can vary and change over time among time and student groups. Okay, so I just have this quick chart just to show you what our scale scores look at. This is a nice little primer for what we're going to be discussing for. This is data from 2022, and it shows you the scale scores from grades 4 and 8 in mathematics. And this is national public data. So what that means is that this is a scale score for where, when we collect all of the sample, what our scale scores are as a nation. And we can go into deep, you'll see state level data as well. All right, and then this shows you the proficiency levels. So the asterisk means that there is statistical significance from the year prior. So we see that the change in 2022 is statistically significant. And you'll see that there are less students at NAEP Proficient, less students at NAEP Advanced, more students at below NAEP Basic and at NAEP Basic. Okay, so when we use NAEP data, we compare across years, we compare across subgroups within a variable, and we can compare across jurisdiction. That's because how the study is designed is this common measure. So I can say, how do Kansas students compare to Kentucky students? How do students in Los Angeles district compare to students in Miami-Dade? We can look at those, and we use averages, percentiles, and percentages. Make sure I don't miss any of my points real quick. All right. So what did we do last year? In NAEP, for 2022, we administered reading and mathematics in grades 4 and 8. So these were our students who would have been like second graders and sixth graders when the pandemic hit. a little over 200,000 both fourth graders and eighth graders were assessed, and 5,700 schools for fourth graders and 5,100 schools participated for the eighth grade eighth grade reading and math score. So it's a lot of students. It is a lot of students that we go in a very short window of time. Also, there's about a 4-week window with an extra week and a half needed if we have to do assessment makeups, but we tried the assessment happens in a short amount of time to capture in that moment where our students are standing. I'm actually gonna go back real quick. I should add that this includes public and private schools. Public schools, if you are selected to participate in NAEP, it is a requirement that you participate. And then private schools are recruited to participate just so we can collect that data. It includes all 50 states. It includes the Department of Defense, who have military schools. It also includes Puerto Rico. And then there are 26 large urban school districts that we collect also from them. Otherwise, district level data is not provided, except for those very large districts. If you think about like New York City, the New York City school district surpasses New York State school district. And so we pull from those as well. Okay, so here's the headlines from what came out. So let's talk about what we saw. I put the top one in because I think that's what, if I'm a learner, especially maybe if I'm in college, when you take this data, a study from Stanford University equated it to a potential loss of $70,000 in lifetime earnings for students. We look at the impact of remote learning, historic lows on some of our scores, gloomy results, devastating results. So again, we think back to what mountaineers say about how the truth will set you free, but first it might break your heart or devastate you. And so while we can look at the data for what it is, maybe some of us find that interesting, these are the stories of our students who are in elementary school, in middle school, in high school, and eventually on our campus, enrolled in our classes, who have experienced significant loss and a significant shift in their educational experience. And so what I like to do, not from this study aspect, but from an educator aspect, where are we meeting them at? Where if they're a mountaineer, if they're hiking up a mountain, where are we meeting them at in their mountain? We can't expect them to be up here based on their own individual experiences. So the major finding is that most states and jurisdictions saw a decline in grades 4 and 8 in both reading and math. You can see where I've broken it out in both math and reading. And the reason why I say most states, not every state in every grade and every subject saw a loss, and we'll go through each of those state maps, but most also didn't see an increase. So you'll see where if you state that you're particularly interested in or overall in regions, we'll be able to view that data. All right, hold on. All right, so let's go. I'm going to break it out by grade and by subject. So we'll go through all of that. If you're overwhelmed or whatever, want to dive into a particular piece of data, we can certainly do that. But let's start first with grades math. And summary for grades 4 and 8, largest ever recorded decline in national scores for grades 4 and 8. The average math score for fourth graders fell by 5 points, eighth graders dropped by 8 points. And that's big. We know if a student can't perform well in math at grade 8, what is going to happen to them when they're in high school? Will they be ready for a college level math course? What does that mean for us as educators developing programs in secondary and post-secondary education? Okay, so grades 4 saw, and I visited with this briefly with some of the colleagues here. The lower performing students, we saw declines for lower performing and higher performing, but the declines for lower performing students was greater than our higher performing students. So students that were already performing poorly are now performing worse than they were before. So that gap widened. We also see that over a quarter of the students performed below NAEP Basic compared to 2019. Lower percentage in NAEP Advanced. We saw score declines based on whether they were American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black, Hispanic students, students of more than one races, and white students. There were score declines for male and female students. We were able to, based on private school participation report, that there was no score change for those students who attended Catholic schools. And there were score declines for all 43 states and jurisdictions. Again, some of those, the Puerto Rico DOD schools in our urban districts, and there were no increases at all. So this is a map. The down arrow obviously means a decline, and those with the blue diamond indicates there was no change in their score from 2019. So that's what this data is showing us, not overwhelmingly, not throughout the course of the study, but from comparing 2022 to 2019, we see a lot of down arrows. All right, let's add more to this data, specifically to grade 4. There was declines in all percentiles. This is the first time since the initial mathematics assessment was given in 1990. The score gaps between white students and their Black and Hispanic peers were larger in 2022 than 2019. That means while we saw declines for in all races, the declines were steeper for Black and Hispanic students. And I don't know how to explain this one, but the score declines for males and females, for female students, the score decline was greater. Okay, I want to make sure I don't miss any of my notes, because that's a lot to. Okay, and then let's look at grade 8. There were consistent score declines across all percentages. Again, we see 38% of students perform below NAEP Basic in grade 8 math. We had seen consistent score declines for Asian, Black, Hispanic, and white students, score declines for male and female students. Surprisingly, no score changes for English learners, and score declines for 51 states and jurisdictions. So let's look at that map real quick. And that's what it looks here. No increases, only 2 without significant changes. And when we examine the grade 8 data just a little bit more, here's what we find. The percentage of students performing below NAEP Basic was larger than all previous assessments dating back to 2003. 73% of the students recalled remote learning last year at some point. But those who were in the higher performing scale scores had frequent access to a desktop computer, laptop, or a tablet all of the time. They also reported more consistent live interactions with their educators. And then a greater decline for female students than male students. Okay, so now let's look at reading. Reading scores also fell for both grades, this time 3 points, so not as steep as what we saw for the math declines. I'm not an education expert, but some of the conclusions drawn from that is that reading tends to be more dependent about what you can do at home. Math is more dependent about what is taught in school. So the decline was not as surprising, that it's not as steep as what it was for math. Overall, for reading, grade 4, larger score declines for lower performing students and higher performing. This is what we saw, similar to what we saw in math. 37% of students perform below NAEP Basic. This is larger compared to 2019. Score declines for American Indian, Alaska Native, Black, Hispanic, and white students. No score changes for students with disabilities or those who attended Catholic schools. And there were score declines for 30 states and jurisdictions. Again, so here's what grade 4's map looks like. Not as many score declines, a lot more that didn't make a change at all. And again, this is comparing 2019 to 2022. So this is the data that is first showing us the brunt of what happened in the 2 years from when NAEP was given in 2019 to 2022.
And it just wasn't collected in 20 and 21.
That's correct. It should have been collected in 2021, and it was just was pivoted to 2022. Yeah.
So how would that map look differently in a non-COVID cycle?
We can pull it. I'll show you.
Okay.
I'll show you how you can pull it too.
Okay.
Okay, so let's go really a little bit more into the grade 4 reading. Score declines for lower, we saw that there were declines in all four regions of the country. Score declines for the lower and higher percentiles for female students, while scores declined at the lower percentile for males. So our higher performing female students decline more and decline for at the lower and higher ends, just the lower ends for male students. Grades 8, we saw consistent score declines across all percentiles. 37% again performed below NAEP Basic. That's concerning. We're grade 8 readers and they are below the NAEP Basic prerequisite knowledge necessary for grade level reading standards. Score decline for white students, so no score declines for other racial and ethnic groups. Again, this is as a nation. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the story for each individual state, but we can say this as a nation. We actually saw a score gain for English learners, those who attended DoD schools, and those who participated in the Los Angeles urban district, but we overall saw most score declines for most states and jurisdictions. And here is, you'll see the one up arrow with the DS, those are our Department of Defense schools. But you can see the overall where students stood. Okay. The number of states with declines in 2022 was the largest dating back to 1998. There was no significant change in the average score for the large city schools that we sampled. And higher performing grade 8 students reported participation in real-time video lessons with their teacher every day or almost every day compared to their low performing peers. And I think that's a big one that we have to pull out of this. We like to think that remote learning looked the same for every student. We say remote learning, that to me, we can think that every student had the same experience remote learning. We don't. We all teach differently. And so what that meant based on and we'll go into the teacher experiences as well, but we know that looks different. Like remote learning, that's a very big spectrum for students. Okay, so some key takeaways. The gap between lower performing and higher performing students widened. Students experienced disrupted learning, though varied. One of the greatest ways that I would apply that from one of the analysis that I was reading in preparation for this was that it was kind of like a tornado that whipped through the country. Same tornado, but often when we see tornadoes in Kansas, some communities are left completely untouched and others are completely leveled. So while we can say that there was disruptive learning, it doesn't necessarily mean that was the only thing that impacted a student's educational experience, but they did experience at some levels some kind of disruption. Struggling students were more likely than their higher performing peers to have inconsistent access to learning resources like digital devices during remote schooling. Compared to the last administration in 2019, teachers reported feeling less inspired and more overworked. Not surprising. They also reported lacking confidence in helping students close the knowledge and skill gaps. For many of them, they were building the plane while they were trying to fly it, right? So that's not surprising that this is how they felt. As part of the assessment, there are survey questions that students, teachers, and administrators have to complete. So this is where some of that other data comes in for educational experience. And so I think that this is important to also understand this is important to have to understand where our students are, but also where our teachers are to know how to close that knowledge and skills gaps. All right, so I pointed to some of you guys have asked a couple questions about, I'm gonna show this quick website because all of this data is public. And you can, let's just do this real quick. If there's interest in drilling down more, so on nationsreportcard.gov, you can pull by state, you can pull by subject, you can pull by year if you are interested in doing that. And it's just a data explorer, so you can pull all of that stuff and see where students stood based on different years. You can pull out subgroups. I want to look at females in Kansas. I want to look at, Black students in the Chicago urban district and compare that with Black students in Miami. You can do all of those various analysis. And then so if you are into this particular data or want to know more, this is where I would direct you to do that. All right, so let's go though. I don't want to just be the focus, I might do, of the data, but I also want to share since this data has been reported, what are we seeing that has been done and that is continuing to be done in our schools? Because I think that's where the hope and the excitement we can feed off of. Okay, so let's talk about some of the policies that are in practice and currently proposed. We saw from COVID that the federal government made its largest investment in American schools, $123 billion. From that investment, a certain percentage has to be designated towards academic recovery efforts. We also see states were providing additional education funding. There has been an increase and a call for a focus on student and teacher mental health. We're seeing expanded summer school or other optional enrichment programming. I should add that it's 20%, I had my notes here, of the funds that the federal government allocated have to be used for academic recovery.
Just to clarify for me, the federal government expenditure is the stimulus package, yeah?
No, it's a separate thing.
It's a separate piece of
Yeah, there's a
federal
separate piece of legislation.
Okay.
What I find most interesting in that I been hearing from our coordinators is that we know that school districts are incredibly attuned to our needs of our students, hopefully at a greater level than that they are at the federal government level. And so many of these actions done that can support what's happening in our school districts are going to have the most fine-tuned effects for our students. We see I think it's actually a school in Oregon, revamped their curriculum to increase student learning engagement and making it more applicable to what their job, a more emphasized approach to what they want to do in the real world to make them not feel like they are bored. Actually, I think I have that in here. Hold on. There was a study that came out about like 75% of graduating high school seniors admitted that they were bored when they were in high school. So if you find a way to make learning applicable to what they want to do, that might help increase or promote academic recovery. This actually came out of so you saw Los Angeles, and their reading was one of the only urban districts to see an increase. They promoted small group tutoring, which is one of their optional enrichment programming, where they do intensive reading for those students who need it. And then there's a lot more educators than I have, but there's doubling up on double tutoring, where it's like a double dose of tutoring where a student gets tutored in a small group or one-on-one, they take a break, and then they tutor again on the exact same subject. And that has shown significant progress of recovering from those learning losses. In Virginia, they have a proposed savings accounts for education-related expenses that they can use in the post-secondary education level. I find that as an interesting option. I don't think that's an option to those of our students who are coming from a lower socioeconomic status. But again, something that a tax-deferred savings program that you can use to then, if your child needs tutoring or something like that, transportation to educational initiatives, you can do something like that. To apply it here to what's happening in post-secondary education, and that is the increase for remedial courses for math and reading, because our students are not necessarily graduating at college level reading and math capabilities. There is a push across the nation for students to be able to recover some of their high school credits that they maybe didn't pass a math or a reading class or another class while due to COVID, and being able to recover that, increase their GPA, make their transcript look better. This one is controversial, and that is revising state standards for curriculum and graduation based on where students are. There is our Department of Education Commissioner Peggy Carr had said, this isn't where we say we should change where our students are. We shouldn't, lessen where our standards. This should be, and nor should our recovery just end once we get back to 2019 levels, but instead we should continue to push and challenge our schools and students to to get students where they were and then go beyond that. I liked this one, so I included it. There is a great call at the local level for libraries, for recreation centers, and all that kind of stuff to open up their facilities for tutoring, for other enrichment camps for the students to recover from where they are. And then I'm gonna bring us back to our mountain real quick. The truth will set you free, but first you have to take the steps to seek it and then learn from it. The learning loss from our pandemic was devastating. Policy, I just said this, policies should not aim to bring us back to pre-pandemic levels, because we were already seeing disparities and inequalities. If you pull in that data from 2019, we already saw that there was disparities and unequal education experience for our students. So that's not where we stop. We were already hearing the alarms from teachers, from students, from districts, from administrators. So this is really an opportunity to learn and grow so that students can learn and grow based on, let me start this over. The opportunity to learn and grow should be made available to all students to climb their own mountain in pursuit of their freedom to live, earn, and contribute. Where students are on their hike up their mountain cannot be where they stop because of the pandemic. The cost is too great. We can quantify that. We can say that in lifetime earnings. We can say that in their mental health. We can say that in the health of our schools, our teachers. We can pull the data and show that there's a lot of work to be done. This is also should be viewed as an opportunity to innovate and find ways in which we can meet students where they are, even if it means they're lower than we'd ever want them to be. And that's what I have for you. Questions? Concerns? Yes?
So on the state-by-state maps that you had, a couple of them, what stood out to me politically is the fact that states that had more significant closures and longer periods of time of closures, and states that had a lot less and less closures, where students went back to the classroom sooner, that there's no trend.
Agreed.
That
And I
there's
think you
no
can,
real.
so that's why there's more to the story of it, and I'm gonna pull up a specific map to demonstrate this one.
And it seems from the data that you presented that one of the strongest indicators of the decline is a lack of access to technology.
Consistent access to, there's more to those surveys of the student experience surveys, including whether or not they were sharing a device, even if they had access to a device, whether or not they were sharing it with, other siblings, whether or not they had access to Wi-Fi, that type of things, and then whether or not the instruction they received was in person or live video, or I'm trying to find, because actually they're one of the most interesting ones for me. Okay, so it's grade 8. So Los Angeles saw a score gain in reading, and they were one of the California schools were one of those that were closed early, stayed closed, implemented very strict COVID precautions. But when you can also pull the data from Miami-Dade, and while their scores declined, they did not decline at the same as other large urban districts, and they were open more. So there is more to the story of whether or not how a school closed, how long they were closed for, those types of things. It's not that, going back to that tornado metaphor, like it was not consistent devastation based on, you can't say a school closed for 6 months, therefore everyone who closed for 6 months experienced the same amount of learning loss. But I think there is definitely how a state approached opening and closing of schools. You could probably pull more of that from the data and examine that more closely to how it equated to learning loss.
I think overall a general statement is none of the teachers that were pushed into teaching online, whether it was successful or not, or deemed successful, had any training on teaching online.
Agreed.
They had no idea what they were doing, and then we have to consider how developmentally like appropriate it was for second graders at the time, which are now fourth graders that you're assessing, could have learned anything online and assess a second grader.
Right.
It's not even really developmentally appropriate for K-12 to really be learning online, so then we have to consider that as too. And access and equity are a huge piece, not even nationwide, but within tons of data that's being reported worldwide about access and equity.
And when we released this data in October, many states had already done at least one round of state assessments, so this data to them was not surprising. They already knew that, it mirrored what they already saw at their state level, and access to resources is not COVID related.
Yeah, it's not new.
It is not
It
new.
just illuminated it.
Agreed. So at the time when 2020 hit, I had a 4-year-old who we were paying for Montessori school, and I'm gonna tell you something, Montessori does not translate online at all, and nor, I mean, when you go to, not that I expect her to do preschool online anyways, but they were one of the best Montessori trained educators in Wichita, and they could not figure out how to teach anything even do a story time online, despite us paying tuition. So it is true that educators, that was got hit by a tornado too, not just our students. But I think what we have to then say is, okay, this is the what, the so what, but now what for our students in elementary, in high school, middle school, but also as they become emergent college students.
Did one of your early slides have more of a 20-year?
This one had, this one had the scale, I had a scale score.
Because what does a 3 or 5 point drop look like over?
So it depends on each jurisdiction based on how the sample was drawn, whether or not you could say it's statistically significant. So we can say that from, this is math, and so you can see where it was in 1990 compared to 2022. 30, we can see an upward trend, but what we were reporting for grade 4 is essentially a 30-year progress that was made over 30, incremental progress made over 30 years, and how that was wiped out, essentially.
So it's been declining, but definitely a significant decline. I mean, potentially a significant decline in the last 3 years, more so than other years.
I was really interested during the pandemic thinking about this and thinking about what affected at different ages. So whether or not my assumption is that a younger age we're going to be more disproportionately affected by this than older, but your data shows not. That
No,
grade
so I would
8
say reading was the same for grades 4 and 8 in the decline, and then math, let me go back. Math had, it was actually 8th grade that we had greater loss than in grade 4.
I mean, I guess I had that assumption partly based off of technology
how you
and
get that.
internet access. Like younger kids probably maybe don't have as much regular internet access as older kids, all other things being equal. But do we have any other data or information other than just grade 4 and grade 8
No, so
about differences in?
Not for this particular study. It's grades 4 and 8, and then sometimes we do grades 12. So in 2024, we will also assess grade 12 in mathematics. I'm sure the data exists somewhere else, but I don't, not for this particular study. And probably also maybe your state assessments could tell you that story for your particular state. Feels good, doesn't it? That's horrible. I'm so sorry. Yeah.
I'm curious, so recently it was announced that in the state of Kansas, there's a $1,000 grant that families can apply for to kind of make up for this learning loss.
And you can apply it towards other educational expenses, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the main, I think, goals of that is so that families can seek tutoring or educational camps or curriculum type things, but it's like, okay, so teachers are already overworked and stressed out. And then there's this huge high demand of all these additional summer school education camps and different things like that. Who's filling in that gap
That's a
of like,
beautiful question.
where are all these coming from?
Right.
Are those few existing opportunities just gonna be flooded with, now
Right.
that there's funding for individual families, like,
Who's gonna do the work?
yeah.
Yeah.
The
And is
teachers
that
that will
gonna
burn out
be
from
the
K-12.
solution, or is it just gonna be more burnout and money thrown towards burnout? I don't know. I'm curious if anyone has heard more of like programmatically, or is there gonna be more offerings of that to?
I mean, I should have probably actually included that one as well in that stuff, but I mean, I think we heard about the substitute teacher shortage and all those things, so
Yeah.
I don't know that money, I don't think that always money is the only way to address a policy issue.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Did the report on the subsequent stuff they reported talk a lot about social and emotional learning and the mental health aspect?
So
Because
what happened?
that's what teachers are telling me. I teach master's level P12 teachers. About 90% of the people I teach are teachers in the field. And they say learning loss, there's statistics out there that say in a few years, it'll take 2 to 3 years for this to kind of cycle through. And this will come back, but the social and emotional aspect is far greater than anything academically that we can measure.
In addition, so when we didn't do the 2021, when we didn't assess in 2021, there was a pivot to a monthly survey of schools where they were reporting those types of things. How are you doing instruction? How are our students in person, hybrid, and also those types of questions about teacher mental health. And that's going to be a more robust study. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head. But it's part of the nation's report card. Than the handful of questions that were reported for the larger NAEP study. But it was, yeah. But that would be where I would pull that data. Anything else? I appreciate your time and discussion on this, and so this was these are the headlines are part of the slide. There was also a podcast where the New York Times dug in specifically to the remote learning experiences for students and how that can be part of what explains some of this learning loss. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming, and of course, thank you for speaking for us. Feel free to grab some extra pizza or buttons or lanyards or whatever, and thank you again all for coming. And thank you to the library for letting us use this space. And that's all.